Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the Wall Street Journal editorial page. I'm Gerry Baker. I'm editor-at-large of the Journal. Thanks for joining us. If you're not already subscribing, please do make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you do your listening. And remember to leave us a nice review.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
This week, the topic of freedom of speech, free expression, the name of this podcast, has been very much in the news. We saw the cancellation and then the uncancellation of Jimmy Kimmel after his rather regrettable remarks about the murder of Charlie Kirk. I'm recording this on Wednesday. Jimmy Kimmel was back on the air last night on Tuesday night. But of course, there's been a much wider conversation that has involved about the extent to which this country is moving away from its ideals and values of freedom, in particular of free speech. We saw the rather unhelpful, I think, intervention of Brendan Carr, the head of the Federal Communications Commission, which seemed to, at least some people's eyes, seemed to lead to the cancellation of Jimmy Kimmel last week. That seems to, again, reflect an authoritarianism that many people perceive on the right. Donald Trump himself has said some pretty harsh things about cancelling his opponents in the wake of some of the really awful things that have been said in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination. But even some, frankly, less outrageous things. Donald Trump does seem to have something of an authoritarian instinct when it comes to people expressing opinions on that he doesn't like on platforms. And it has led to this, as I say, this sort of wider debate about whether or not illiberalism on the right is now a characterization of the way this country is going. But of course, I think it is very important to understand also, as many people have pointed out, the wider context that this, and indeed one of the justifications for some of the things that Donald Trump and his administration are doing, comes from the fact that we have lived in this country for the last 10 or 15 years or so under a kind of progressive left-wing hegemony in many of our cultural institutions, in which dissenting opinion, conservative opinion, right-wing opinion has been pretty well suppressed. We have seen the domination of, as I say, that sort of progressive left-wing view on most of our television networks, including ABC and those late-night talk shows. We've seen it obviously entrenched in our universities and the academia. We've seen it in the tech area with the attempts to, and in fact successful attempts, to crush and to extirpate stories that were harmful to Joe Biden in the 2020 election, and the way in which the Biden administration then used social media to put pressure on social media to eliminate ideas and thoughts and opinions that it didn't like. So that, again, fits into this broader picture that we've seen, as I say, of this kind of progressive hegemony of the culture that we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years or so, which really does marginalize cancel culture as its cause, sort of marginalized dissenting opinion. So this has obviously been as I say, the kind of dominant topic of the week. This week, I'm delighted to be joined to discuss some of that, but more broadly to discuss the broader political cultural environment that we found ourselves in the last 10 years. I'm delighted to be joined by Thomas Chatterton Williams, author, commentator, journalist, writes for The Atlantic. He's out with a new book, which looks at, in particular, the way in which race and identity and the progressive ideology around identity, identitarianism, the primacy of racial, gender, sexuality, identity, the way that has been used to essentially to control political discourse, to control debate in the country over the last 10 years, particularly around, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement and the summer of 2020, but more broadly in our cultural and media and political institutions. His book is called Summer of Discontent, The Age of Certainty and the Demise of Discourse. Of course, again, it's sort of one of its central focus, that summer of 2020, but it looks more broadly at the rise of identitarian politics and the impact that that's had on our public discourse. And Thomas Chatterton Williams joins me now. Thomas, thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, congratulations on the book, which has received a lot of attention already. And I want to get into the central arguments of the book about racial identity and about the way in which particularly during the summer of 2020 and afterwards, the way in which are sort of prevailing, if you like, kind of prevailing progressive ideology resulted in the kind of cancel culture and the kind of intolerance that we saw. But we're recording this on Wednesday morning. We record this obviously after the horrific events of the last couple of weeks, the murder of Charlie Kirk, and the reaction to that we've seen. Mixed reaction. Let's be honest. I think most people, to be fair, horrified by the murder, have condemned it. There have been those on the left who've kind of, while condemning it, have maybe excused it. There have been maybe those on the right who've maybe sought to exploit it for political reasons. We've seen this whole back and forth over the cancellation and then uncancellation of Jimmy Kimmel on ABC, and a wider kind of roiling debate here about who is to blame for this increasing climate of intolerance here. Just if we start off again before we get into the nitty gritty of your book, give me your sense about the events of the last couple of weeks and what they tell us about the climate of public discourse here in America right now.
Well, like you and like everybody else that I'm aware of, I was absolutely shocked and horrified by what happened in Utah a couple of weeks ago when Charlie Kirk was assassinated while engaging in public debate. I think anybody who puts out opinions for a living and goes into spaces to engage with audiences was afraid in a new way, or was aware of the fact that one could actually be killed for ideas, which I think is a threshold that we've crossed now, that had felt like we were not in a danger of crossing just recently. So that is extraordinarily alarming. And I think that the idea that ideas, even ones that we find offensive and really disagree with, have to be defeated or counteracted with other ideas, with other speech, that's something that Charlie Kirk seemed to genuinely believe in, and that is the best legacy we could have with him. We should really honor the idea that you go and you keep talking to people you disagree with. You don't end debates or trump debates by resorting to the silencing of your opponent through violent means. This kind of reaction to his death has been very scary to me. This idea that some people can't be negotiated with, and then the exploitation of the tragedy, which I think is also equally, if not more alarming, the idea that there is half of the country that is your enemy, that we are so polarized that, some of our leaders, Elon Musk comes to mind, people who control huge, enormous platforms where we engage each other, saying they want you dead. They is this very dangerous term, because I don't know anybody that fits this description, but we are in a kind of dangerous escalation pattern where half of the country is regarded as some kind of opponent, and even a kind of foreign opponent. And I think that we really have to find leaders who will tone things down as opposed to kind of ratchet things up.
Your book is, as I said, a look at this essentially the sort of illiberalism, the climate of illiberalism that we have developed in this country over the last decade or so. I think it's fair to say it's an even-handed book. It's a fairly balanced book. Some of your liberal critics, your left-wing critics, it's too balanced for their liking. They think you should be. It should have been more balanced towards critique of the right and Donald Trump and some of the authoritarian tendencies that he demonstrates. But tell us, just give us again your. First of all, again, what the book is about, and the Summer of Discontent, which of course I know you mean in a broader sense, but obviously we all think about that summer of 2020. What has happened to what has happened on the left that has along these what you call these identitarian lines, these ideas that people should be defined by their racial, gender, sexual orientation, identity. What has happened on the left, and how has that become this, or rather, how has it been used as a vehicle for essentially kind of for marginalizing dissent from that? So, give us your overall thesis, if you like, of the book.
Sure. The book is really a journey through the past 2 decades or so of American culture and politics, trying to make sense of how we came from this moment of what seemed like hope and optimism, that we were transcending past oppressions and divisions and moving towards a kind of multi-ethnic, post-racial, colorblind society. When Barack Obama arrived on the scene, and you had these amazing Gallup polls that showed even McCain voters felt extraordinary pride in the country and felt optimistic about the future of race in the country. And it starts there, and it tries to understand why did such disillusionment take hold on both the left and the right, and then really break through in the summer of 2020. And so a big part of that story, to get to the heart of your question, is that on the left, during the Great Awakening, or this era of social justice that really started, I say, in the second Obama administration, 2012, death of Trayvon Martin, beginning of Black Lives Matter, through the Me Too movement, a kind of intolerance for opposing views and dissent, a kind of moral clarity that dictated there was only one correct position or framework for viewing highly complicated events, and that people who did not ascribe or subscribe to this view were actually were unwelcome in the public sphere, that had to be silenced or banished, fired, scapegoated, piled on. This kind of left illiberalism really dominated the institutions that matter in society: our universities, our mainstream media, even our museums, and took hold in Hollywood and our entertainment industries. A kind of left illiberalism, I think, really set the table for a backlash that we're living through now. One of the reasons this backlash has been so surprising to people, I think, is because we were living through a decade and a half of preference falsification, where people were simply, by and large, afraid to say what they really thought, but they would go into the voting booth and they would make known their displeasure with the dominant culture. And so now we've had a kind of culture shift that has happened. I think that this period of Great Awakening came to an end, and we are seeing a kind of realignment and readjustment of the culture rightward. But I don't think that this is necessarily salutary. I think that there has been a pendulum swing that has not settled in a kind of normal middle that most people would feel comfortable with, but it has whipped over to the right, and we're seeing a kind of a perverse mirror image of that intolerant impulse that's now being enacted from the government down.
How did that come about? As you say, 2008, we can all remember it. I remember writing myself as a conservative who, did not support Barack Obama's policies, that whatever one thought of it, this was an extraordinary moment for America, a real moment of real hope, but of sort of culmination of the addressing of all of the obviously the great racial divide that has existed in America for so long. How did we go from that moment? What happened? I mean, and as you answer that, how do we go from that to the summer of 2020, or Trayvon Martin during Obama's presidency, or some of the Ferguson incident in Missouri? We seem to go from this sort of this moment of the sort of the culmination, again, as I say, of overcoming these racial problems, into a whole into a significantly worse racial environment over the next 10 years. And to what extent was, some people do think that Barack Obama himself was to blame for that. You write a little bit about this in the book. What did happen after 2008 that took the country from this precipice of apparently being a post-racial society to being apparently mired right back into the kind of racial divisions that we seem to see, that we've not seen really since the civil rights movement of the 60s?
Yeah, well, it's a complicated answer. I think that, first of all, it was probably always too much to expect that one man and one politician could transform a nation, certainly in a short amount of time. And so I think that the kind of emotional expectations that we placed on Obama's electoral victories were always too much. And I think that he really didn't have much latitude for making mistakes. So when he did fail to respond to highly controversial and divisive events, when he responded in a way that resembled the identity politics that we had been accustomed to and failed to deliver on the post-racial kind of future, I think that we penalized him for that misstep more than we would another politician. So one instance that comes to mind is the death of Trayvon Martin, where he injected a kind of identity lens, saying that if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. And then another was the beer summit with Henry Louis Gates Jr., when he made comments that injected a kind of racial response from the presidential level into a local police matter. I think Americans really didn't ever forgive him in the polls after that. But that's too simple to say that is why, the kind of future that we had hoped for didn't come to pass. I think that we have to be very honest that even among some of the white Americans and non-Black Americans who voted for Barack Obama and initially supported him, they may have found the idea of the first Black president or the post-racial president appealing in theory more than in practice. And the way he governed did not resonate with them. And there was kind of always a backlash. As soon as he got in office, there was the Tea Party, and there was a kind of visceral response. I think we have to always remember that he also didn't do certain things in the wake of the financial crisis that helped, I think, middle of the road, middle class Americans feel that the government was on their side. There was an enormous inequality that bloomed after 2008 and has only gotten worse. So the first Black president didn't actually make middle-class Americans feel that he had their back when he bailed out the banks. And then I think that there's a technological aspect to this that can't ever be discounted, which is that his presidency coincided with the rise of social media and the iPhone. And so when the first Black president was in office and you had all these videos that were shared and I think amplified and were disproportionately thought to represent American reality, these videos of Black people being killed at the hands of police or vigilantes, I think that there was a kind of disillusionment that bloomed on the left where people said, nothing has changed. This was supposed to be the culmination of this is where the arc of the moral universe was supposed to end. And here we have the same old thing happening and nothing ever changes. So there was certainly that. And then, Hillary Clinton was supposed to further move the liberal project forward and be the first woman president, and she loses to Donald Trump. And so this sense of disillusionment really keeps escalating, snowballing. So it's a multifaceted kind of inability to deliver.
Do you think Trump's election, succeeding obviously Barack Obama, defeating Hillary Clinton in that year of 2016, was that to some extent, I hesitate to use the word, but was that to some extent a backlash, especially from white Americans, at what they had seen as, again, instead of the sort of post-racial America that Barack Obama promised, but actually seemed to be re-upping or sort of re-emphasizing the kind of the racial divisions and the inequalities and all of the American and the baleful history that America has. Do you think to some extent Trump's support in 2016 and perhaps even more in 2024 was a kind of was a lot of white Americans saying, I've heard enough of this, being told that we're the oppressors, we're these terrible people, and that we're responsible for the suffering of Black Americans, and actually I'm going to start perhaps using identity politics myself and by voting as a white American rather than as an American.
Certainly that has, I think, become more and more the case, specifically by 2024. In 2016, I think, Hillary Clinton very nearly won. She had significantly more votes in the popular vote. So it was a close election. But I think that enough Americans were turned off by the idea that, there was a kind of elite status quo that wasn't very much in their interest, and they wanted an outsider. They clearly showed that on the left that they were open to an outsider like Bernie Sanders, and the status quo kind of gathered together to eliminate him as a viable threat. Donald Trump maintained that outsider status. And I think that was a huge part of it. I'm not even sure it can be reduced entirely to racial issues. In that sense, Hillary Clinton as a woman and Barack Obama as a Black president were nonetheless stewards of a kind of status quo that was not serving middle Americans or that they felt wasn't serving them. Interestingly enough, with Trump, I think something that gets short shrift still to this day, specifically on the left, is that all of these explanations that he is simply in power because of white racism fail to take into account the fact that he has steadily grown his support among Blacks and Latinos and Asians. He has cobbled together a multi-ethnic kind of working class coalition that represents the Republican nominee with the most support among non-whites since Richard Nixon. I mean, that means something. So I think there's a kind of I want to make sure when I say that there was a racial backlash against Obama that I always take into account how kind of dynamic and contradictory and surprising American society can be. Donald Trump got nearly a quarter of the Black male vote in 2024. He really did well with Latino voters as well. And to just say that it's a kind of white supremacist response doesn't do it justice. At the same time, there is this aspect, and I try to really draw this out in the book, there's this aspect of a race fatigue and a sense that for over a decade, many groups, racial and sexual and otherwise, were not just encouraged, but were mandated to kind of advocate for themselves in terms of their group identity. But white Americans were told not to, and that was considered disreputable. And after a certain amount of time, you're absolutely right. There became a kind of explicit political movement to advocate for white identity as such. Many of us actually warned that was the inevitable consequence of the kind of identity politics that was being played on the left.
Right, and politically risky in a country where 70% of the country is still white, right?
Yeah, I feel like we've always kind of neglected to recognize that, the majority is still a huge numerical majority, and that matters in electoral politics. But, Trump has kind of this amazing ability to both benefit from white identity politics and from a kind of multi-ethnic coalition of working class rejection of elite manners and etiquette on the left.
That's a good point. And your point about the multi-ethnic coalition that Trump has built, particularly in 2024, is really interesting. And you talk a lot about this in the book about the importance or the primacy, what should be the primacy of economic considerations that which the focus on race and to some extent gender and sexuality and these other identities kind of overlooked that. I mean, traditionally the left, traditionally those who look out for the disadvantaged had been focused very much on economic disadvantage, and that kind of seemed to be replaced sometime, from the 1980s, 90s onwards with increasing focus on race and gender and, intersectionality and all this kind of stuff, which of course, fail to take account of the fact that, quite significant numbers of ethnic minority members have actually done economically quite well. You talk about this in the context of reparations and this argument that about reparations for Black Americans. Well, there are, not in any way to pick on them, but do Barack Obama's daughters deserve to receive special treatment from the state for the historical sin of slavery and of racism when they are obviously extraordinarily advantaged? And so talk about that, about how the Black experience is by no means one of continued sort of repression, or at least in terms of their ability to achieve great things. That was one of the things that we saw in 2008 was that so many minority Americans, Black Americans, Hispanic Americans had been able to actually succeed quite well. I'm not in any way. We know the data. I know, of course, that overall Black Americans, have lower living standards, have lower incomes. But that emphasis on that did seem to ignore the fact that there were the individual agency seemed to be being downgraded, if you like, in the larger idea of single racial identity.
I couldn't agree with you more. One of the points I really try to make in the book is that George Floyd's fundamental identity was that of a poor man in America, first and foremost. Most Black Americans don't have an experience that looks anything like George Floyd's. He was strung out on drugs. He was resorting to using a counterfeit bill because he had no money. The idea that George Floyd's death revealed a fundamental, inexorable white supremacy and systemic racism in the country that meant that Black Ivy League graduates had to be compensated, or that there was a kind of an essential Black identity that was shared even in the most elite spaces, and that we needed to think about representation in Hollywood or on Broadway, and that would somehow make whole people, the actual American subaltern who were facing the kind of situations that Floyd found himself in. That always struck me as not just wrong, but on some level even immoral. And that, in the 21st century, are people in George Floyd's situation poor in part because of the legacy of racial oppression in this country? Of course, I'm not so naive as to say that those things are never interrelated, but it is too simple to say that this is a black and white issue and to neglect the kind of changes that would have to happen so that people don't find themselves as vulnerable as the poorest among us do. I think it would also do a lot to heal our politics if we could recognize that, yes, some 70% of Americans, as you said, are white, and an enormous amount of poor Americans are white, and that policies that address poor people would disproportionately help racial minorities, but they would also allow people to feel that there's a certain equality that is fair. I think also that some of these Black males who are working class and were attracted to Donald Trump's rhetoric criticizing the Democratic Party were attracted to it because they don't see themselves benefiting from the DEI or affirmative action or the policies that are said to be pursued in their name. They see that being captured by the elite of their racial group who claim to represent them, but don't actually, they hoard the opportunities that come through that kind of rhetoric. And so they feel very alienated from that too. I think that class-based analysis would allow even the racial minorities to feel that things are more equally done. So I try to make the argument that identity politics as it has been pursued has really served no one, not white Americans and not racial minorities either.
All right, let's talk about 2020 in particular, because again, a lot of the book is about that and the aftermath. We all saw that horrifying moment. You describe it yourself very well in the book when you saw, you were living in France and saw that horrifying moment of George Floyd's death, the apparent callous cruelty. We can argue about the specific circumstances or talk about it, but the apparent callous cruelty of the police officer with his knee on his neck. We're all horrified by that. But how did that outrage at that, understandable outrage at that, how did that explode into this not just protest movement about malfeasance by police officers, which of course there always is, we know that, but into this, frankly, crazy idea, which seemed to be subscribed to by enormous numbers of Americans, that this was a snapshot of a genocide being carried out by white police officers, white people more generally, against black people, which again, by any measure, not in any way to downplay instances of, as I say, police brutality or indeed of racism, all this kind of stuff. But the idea that gripped the country, that this was an ongoing genocide. When the statistics don't remotely suggest anything of the sort, that far greater numbers, relative to the total number of encounters between police officers and black people, it's a relatively small number of people, tragically and horribly, but a very small number of people who are killed or wounded. How did we get into this situation where, and again, the Black Lives Matter movement somehow was suddenly empowered in this way with its most extreme account of what was going on in America, suddenly subscribed to by not just by millions of Americans, by companies, by political leaders taking the knee, all of this stuff. How did we get into that situation from that moment, Thomas?
One of the best frameworks I've come across for thinking about what we saw and what happens, not just in America, but it seems to be a kind of a universal impulse. It's the Tocqueville paradox, or the Tocqueville effect. Alexis de Tocqueville, the great French aristocratic observer of American society in the 19th century, he wrote this also about the strongholds of resistance during the French Revolution. He observed that where the French Revolution really was most powerful was in the regions of the country that were doing the best, actually. And I think that it makes sense in retrospect to look back at the age of the first Black president, where every kind of glass ceiling has been broken, where Black Americans have demonstrated that they've been fully included in American society, when we have the most kind of inclusive representation in elite universities and corporate culture and the arts, when we have a kind of discourse that acknowledges slights like microaggressions and things like this, when we live in an era of second-class citizenship and Jim Crow, but when the races have become, or what's called the races, have become more and more equal, you find that there's a kind of inability to bear even the kind of slightest inequality. That in times of great inequality, my father was raised in the segregated South. The idea of a microaggression would be completely foreign to him.
There were macroaggressions, yeah.
Exactly. But as we live on more and more equal terms, then the feeling that there exists even the slightest injustice becomes unbearable. And so the video of one Black man dying unjustly in police custody becomes too much to bear and takes on a symbolic weight that's out of proportion with what is actually happening in American society. And so it takes on a symbolic power that I think we were enthralled to. That's a huge aspect of it. And I don't think it can be discounted. Then there's also this kind of, we were in a moment of moral panic. We haven't talked about this at all, but I think that there was a space opened up by the pandemic in which the kind of normal life and the routines that kind of regulate our responses to things were in suspension. And, there became a kind of urge to rebel. On the right, people manifested in the streets and protested against stay-at-home orders. This was something that was considered impossible to do on the left. It was kind of associated with MAGA politics. As soon as George Floyd died, that impulse to rebel was able to be directed into a kind of anti-racist moral righteousness. And so I think that was kind of also, it was convenient. There was already an urge to rebel, but the moral story gave it a kind of respectability that allowed it to be done on the left.
How much of it too was a kind of a piece of opportunism, either political opportunism or frankly financial opportunism? To some extent there's a grift quality, right, to some of this sort of professional
people
race
made money.
Identity politics. Yeah, I mean, you talk about these in the books, the Robin DiAngelos of the White Fragility and the Ibram X. Kendis and Nicole Hannah Jones with her 1690 project. These became enormously successful individuals and their books and their projects and all of these things. They've enriched themselves. Black Lives Matter enriched itself enormously. We saw some scandals associated with that. And of course, companies, terrified in this moment of national moral panic, were happy to hand over, millions, tens of millions in a kind of a shakedown, as far as it looked. So, please, don't expose me on social media and embarrass me on social media. I'll sign up. How much of it do you think was, frankly, just an element of sort of this sort of pure opportunism?
Well, I think that most people probably can't be completely cynical. So it's always convenient when the morally correct thing to do is also the thing that serves your career trajectory the best. And I think people all of us probably have a way of thinking that what's right to do is also the thing that gets me paid better and gets me speaking gigs. But at the same time, you have a kind of situation where Black Lives Matter was quickly revealed to be, at least at the leadership level, something that enriched a very few people by using the names of victims who saw no financial benefit. You had the situation where the mother of Tamir Rice and other victims of police violence asked Patrisse Cullors and other leaders of Black Lives Matter to stop using their children's name to buy themselves more luxury homes. 1619 Project became, just an extraordinarily commercially successful product. You had Ibram X. Kendi selling books called Anti-Racist Baby and things like this. There was an enormous economic component to it. And I think Hannah Arendt had a very valuable insight last century when she said that, moral panics are also, and purges are also jobs programs. When you topple the editor of the opinion pages of the New York Times, you open up a kind of space for yourself and your friends and colleagues to move up. So getting people canceled was also in the interest of junior employees who embraced this kind of moral panic. Musa Al-Gharbi, the sociologist, wrote a very interesting book last year called We Have Never Been Woke, which made the case that, there was a kind of convenient marriage between self-interest and moral righteousness that really was the driving force of wokeness, and it can't be discounted.
The wider impacts of that whole summer and its aftermath clearly continues to reverberate. One of the things, and you talk about this in the book, again, it's been quite controversial in some quarters. Some people have objected to it. But you talk about January the 6th, 2021, and the infamous assault on the Capitol and the attempt to get the 2020 election result overturned, and the violence that we saw that day, which, of course, again, I think all decent people condemn, whatever their views on the election. But you talk, and of course you do too, but you do say, you put that into the context of what had happened in 2020 in the way that what happened, the protest, the violent protest, the mostly peaceful protest, as the infamous CNN Chiron had it, while a city was burning behind them, those extraordinary protests, the violence that we saw then did somehow seem to have a kind of a read across on a wider population, and did seem to be to some extent to legitimate direct action, as the French call it, taking to the streets to get your political way. Talk about that a little bit and how you see January the 6th in that context.
Well, I think people on the left are really fooling themselves if they think that violence happens in a vacuum, or that chaos doesn't beget chaos. I think, one of the reasons that liberals argue for nonviolent means of resolving disagreements and negotiating and seeing politics not as zero-sum, one of the reasons that is a value of liberalism is because once you open the Pandora's box of solving political disputes through violence and disorder in the street, you can't contain how far that goes. So I think, the country during a moment of pandemic and insecurity and uncertainty and fear was fed a stream of images of cities burning, being sacked, of people refusing to accept other points of view, of people deciding that they could burn a building down when not feeling sufficiently heard. I think people were fed a diet of that imagery, and then to think that would have no impact at all about what they would feel themselves entitled to do when feeling similarly overlooked, to think that would not be able to even be exploited by a demagogue who propagandized his followers is very naive. And so, I think January 6th is more significant in many ways. I think that, you cannot downplay what it means to erect a hangman's gallows on the Mall and call for the vice president to be extrajudicially killed for treason. I think that has to be taken quite seriously. I think attacking police officers and sacking the very symbols of our American democracy is on a scale that burning down a Foot Locker is not. But to think that happens not in dialogue with the kind of the sacking of Portland, with the razing of Kenosha, with the assault on Minneapolis, that's very naive, and it doesn't take into account how people's psychology actually works. I think there was so much frustration and so much feeling of being gaslit and lied to for months during the summer of 2020 and the fall of 2020. It is not frivolous to keep saying that this CNN Chiron fiery but mostly peaceful protests was received by much of the country as a kind of a domination, a discursive domination, a rhetorical
Yeah.
domination of what they can see with their own eyes to be reality.
Do you think now we've had an election in which Donald Trump has won an unquestioned majority popular vote win and a solid majority in the Electoral College? We've seen, I think, some on the left at least backing off some of the sort of the identitarian. There's an internal debate going on in the Democratic Party about how important that is. I think there is. Do you think there's been, to use their own language, there's been a reckoning, or are we in the process of a reckoning among the left, among that sort of cultural elite that, in universities and media and elsewhere, that maybe that all did go too far, and that maybe Donald Trump's win in 2024 represented a kind of wider repudiation of it? Do you think that is happening, or are these people still very much wedded to this idea politic?
Among Democrats and politicians who want to win, there has absolutely been a reckoning, and that message has been received. I've been very impressed by how quickly that message seems to have been received. It's not to say that we have a political leader that has emerged who has started to develop a vision for American society that can win at the polls and counteract Donald Trump's. But I think that message has certainly been received among the political class that wants to actually govern and win power. I am pretty dismayed that there seems to be a kind of activist wing of the left that still is a numerical minority, but wishes to dominate and control the media institutions, the universities, and certainly that talks to itself on Blue Sky and on corners of Twitter, and refuses to give an inch, and thinks that, real wokeness or real Trump derangement syndrome hasn't even been tried yet, and we have to double down on these kind of ideas and strategies that have proven so disastrous. There certainly is that. There has not been an about face everywhere, but I don't think that activist wing can control the Democratic Party anymore. And they were browbeating and dominating candidates in the past two elections. Kamala Harris in large part seems to have lost because the ACLU got her and some other candidates to say on tape in 2019 that they would support taxpayer-funded gender-affirming surgeries for undocumented immigrants. I mean, that is something that no politician on their own would come up with. But, the ACLU was able to kind of force politicians to take extraordinary stands that are not popular with the American public. And of course, one of the most effective political ads in recent history was Donald Trump's Kamala is for they, them, and Trump is for you, that played off of that kind of mistake. I don't think that kind of activist power exists anymore on the left.
We're almost out of time. We've talked a lot about the book, and I hope people do read it. But sometimes, in the way of these things, social media posts on X or wherever can have almost as much impact, if not more impact, than a book. And I just want to talk to you about something that's happened just in the last few days. You posted on X. I spotted it, as a lot of people did, and I found it very interesting. You posted on X just after the memorial service for Charlie Kirk in Arizona. You posted pictures of that service, Donald Trump and Erica Kirk, Charlie Kirk's widow, and another picture of people raising their hands in a kind of moment of sort of religious sort of fervor, I suppose one could describe it. And you posted this. You said, "I've spent half my adult life living in one foreign country or another, and I don't think I've ever felt so estranged from the surrounding culture as I am from the aesthetics and sensibilities of this movement," this being the Charlie Kirk, the movement that was represented at the Charlie Kirk Memorial. "Not even a criticism, you say. I just feel more at home in Greece than in these images." This is, been greeted with a lot of opprobrium from many people on the right, saying, "Then go and live in Greece, go leave the country, whatever." It struck me though, because I just want to ask you about this, because I'm an immigrant to this country. I've lived here for 30 years. I love this country, and it is fascinating to me, and I think your post captures in a way, in many ways, sort of the defining kind of cleavage in this country, which is, I think, the American America's always had this kind of duality about it, if you like. There's the American exceptionalism. It is a very, very different country from the rest of the world, the rest of the Western world, politically, culturally, and all of these things. We know all this, the role of religion and guns and, or everything. You mentioned de Tocqueville earlier. De Tocqueville, 200 years ago, captured some of this stuff. It's a very different country. And yet it is also a universal country. It's a country of universal ideals. It purports to have universal ideals. And generally speaking, the dominance of American culture is huge. The values of American ideals. So I just wanted to close by asking you about that and about that tension, if you like, between American exceptionalism and what I understand what you were saying in that post, the sort of the strangeness to some extent of this, of some of this political culture that we're seeing at the moment, combined with, again, the continuing belief that so many people have in America about the shining city on a hill and the last best hope for humanity and all of that. Explain what you were thinking when you posted that and what you meant about that sense of alienation from this very, very, very sort of quintessentially classic American culture.
Yeah, thanks for asking me about that. I just, right before we spoke, Meghan McCain responded to that tweet. So it has certainly kind of struck a chord.
No, you got a lot of again, some favorable, a lot of hostile responses.
Yeah, a lot of large right-wing accounts seized on it to make a point that kind of coastal elite hates you and doesn't understand you. I would say that, Twitter is not the place to try to you never complain, you never explain on Twitter, I think. But if we can talk about it, I would say, well, it was interesting that many people seem to be taking that as me saying that Christianity is foreign to me, which couldn't be further from the truth. From kindergarten through undergrad at Georgetown, I went to Catholic school, and my grandfather was a Baptist minister, and my mother's side of the family are evangelical Christians. So those are not foreign concepts or practices to me. But what I was really seeing in those images was a kind of wedding of a certain type of Christianity with a kind of political cult of personality around Donald Trump. With a kind of aesthetics and a way of talking and interacting and wearing kind of clothing to signal being part of a group, and a kind of political religious melding that felt very strange to me, that I think would feel strange to George W. Bush, that would feel strange to Mitt Romney. I think there's a kind of movement in the country that is centered around the figure and the leader that is Donald Trump, this MAGA kind of Christianity that is not necessarily even legible to an evangelical Christian like my mother. So that's what I was trying to talk about. People seem to think that, it's evidence that a kind of globalist elite hates America. But what I meant by saying that I feel more at home in Europe, in Greece, but it could be Oslo. It could. I spend much of my time in Paris. That's where I'm raising my children. There is a kind of skepticism of those kind of folk expressions and rituals and ways of being together that is in a kind of mega church culture and a kind of following of a leader. There's a kind of skepticism that you would find if you were in Munich or Milan that would be closer to how I feel than me going into one of those rooms and kind of catching the Holy Ghost for Donald Trump and listening to him talk about tariff policy at a memorial service. There's something quite strange. If you're not under the spell of Trump, I think it's very difficult for you to understand what is so appealing. And what I meant by that was not even a criticism. It was saying that I can't fully understand how this man is entertaining and swaying so many of my fellow countrymen. I feel like there is a real division.
Well, you captured that very well. And as I say, you certainly sparked further debate. But Thomas Chatterton Williams, thank you very much. The book is Summer of Our Discontent, The Age of Certainty and the Demise of Discourse. Really interesting book. Great conversation. Thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression. Thanks
so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression. Hope you'll join us again next week. We'll have another lengthy conversation about one of the big topics in the news and what's driving our politics and culture. In the meantime, have a great week. Thanks again for joining us.